Hi, I'm Callie Duritsa Boswell, and today I'm discussing Douglas Winiarski's article on Jonathan Edwards and Revivalism during the Great Awakening. My focus is on how Edwards understood authentic faith and how his ideas help us trace a legacy of discernment and Christian responsibility in American public life. This video does four things. First, I summarize Winiarski's argument about how Edwards navigated the tension between true spiritual awakening and emotional access. Second, I evaluate the article's scholarly strengths and limitations. Third, I place Edwards in context, both theologically and historically. And finally, I show how his framework can help us interpret later moral leadership, including that of Eleanor Roosevelt as a reflection of enduring theological patterns. Winiarski challenges the common view that Jonathan Edwards embraced enthusiasm. Instead, Edwards insisted that genuine spiritual affection had to produce visible, lasting moral fruit. He asked for plain speaking and spiritual charity in action and deed, something that is obvious in the conduct of my subject focus, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. For him, emotional displays were not proof of godliness. The true test was whether someone lived in humility, acted with discipline, and consistently sought the good of others, even when no one was watching. Winiarski makes it clear that Edwards was not anti-revival. However, he was deeply concerned with what came after the emotional moment, the evidence of a transformed life. And I believe that's something that we can see in First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, as well as New York's Francis Perkins, who was part of the inner circle of FDR when he was governor. Jonathan Edwards says that the depth of human sin, the heart is exceedingly deceitful and desperately wicked, and this aligns with his emphasis on original sin and the total depravity of man, which is a stark contrast to later Finiate theology. In the Connecticut Valley, where Edwards lived and preached, the First Great Awakening caused a major social and ecclesiastical upheaval. Winiarski places Edwards right at the heart of that storm, affirming that spirit's movement while warning against false conversions and religious performance. This historical context matters because it shows Edwards trying to preserve a spiritual core without losing order. His theology was pastoral, concerned with how Christians actually lived. A revival is a work of God. It is not brought to pass by the wisdom or effort of man, is what Edwards saw as a revival of a sovereign act of God, not human orchestration. One of Winiarski's biggest strengths is how deeply he engages with Edwards' actual writings. He avoids caricatures and presents Edwards as both intellectually rigorous and spiritually discerning. I also appreciated how Winiarski uses local case studies grounding Edwards' theology in real revival experiences rather than just theory, which is something that Edwards did himself in his writings. Finally, the article gives us a textured and realistic view of religious life in early America rather than an oversimplified perspective. A theme in Jonathan Edwards' work was emotional experience and religious awakening. Edwards believed in both reason and affections, intense spiritual emotions as evidence of true conversion. This justifies the emotional fervor seen in both great awakenings. And certainly this fervor, this intense spiritual emotion is something that we see in Eleanor Roosevelt's daily newspaper writings when she's bringing the problems of everyday humble Americans to the plate of her husband FDR, much to his consternation. It annoyed him to no end, as we know. However, she was his eyes and ears and legs, and she took that responsibility greatly. And some of the work that I'll be bringing in is about the letters that everyday Americans wrote her during wartime, desperate to get help for their loved ones and to find answers, which she was so devoted to doing. Lastly, the limitations of this specific article meant that it was very tightly focused only on one region, the Connecticut Valley, and only on one generation of people. It would have been stronger with a bit more analysis of how Edwards' framework influenced later religions or civic leaders, and there's also little attention to gender or social class. This might have complicated our view of who was seen as authentically Christian. In the enrichment and contrast with Eleanor Roosevelt and lived faith, Jean Bethke Elshtain writes that Eleanor Roosevelt practiced a deeply Christian ethic of service, but without the emotionalism we might associate with revivalism. Roosevelt's faith was expressed through public action and moral clarity, as well as a quiet responsibility during wartime. The significance for moral leadership was that Winiarski and Edwards offer a lens for evaluating leadership, and it's based on neither charisma nor emotion, but on the fruit, discernment, and long-term witness. And in our current moment, where public faith often feels performative, this historical framework is especially meaningful. It invites us to think about Christian leadership and about how one lives, and being in daily integrity, in moral courage, and in responsible service. And these are things that the New Dealers, such as Francis Perkins and Eleanor Roosevelt, as well as Eleanor Morgenthau, who was Jewish, certainly observe. And in conclusion, Winiarski's article gives us a deep, rich understanding of Jonathan Edwards as a theological and pastoral leader. Edwards' concern for spiritual authenticity tested through action, which still speaks powerfully today. By tracing these themes forward, we can better understand how Christian faith has shaped American moral leadership in quieter and enduring ways. Winiarski says, as Jonathan Edwards would argue, revival is not a decision of man, but a divine interruption, a work of God. And by the time of Charles Finney, that theology had flipped. And as Winiarski notes, Finney recast the believer as an active agent in salvation, removing revival from the mystery and placing it into method. Thank you so much for being with me today, and we will see you next time.